John, what's up, buddy?
Hey man, always good to see you.
Yeah, man, I see you've gotten all fixed up and seems like you got lots more movement now and all that physical therapy and work has paid
Yes,
off, right?
yes, my 9 screws and however many centimeter plate in my right collarbone is. I don't think it's necessary. I think they can take it out here soon. But I'm all healed and
Hmm.
exceeded the physician's expectations. So it just goes
Nice.
to show you what a great physician, a team, and then a proper plan. As you know, all kinds about planning, right? About what a good plan can do for accomplishing a goal.
Can you feel the weather now with your screws? I hear people say that they can like,
I can't. I can't, but I don't know. I guess I don't pay attention to the weather. So,
yeah,
but I mean,
nice,
it rained the other day, and I'm like, I guess I didn't notice it, but I don't think so. We'll see. We'll see.
nice.
I did go to an airport the other day, I'm like, oh wait, they never gave me like a little card. I thought it was going to go off, and I was going to get like pulled aside, but I don't know if it's like I don't know what it's made out of, but it didn't go off. Maybe it's like titanium, and the titanium doesn't go off or something. I don't
Huh.
know, but it didn't go off
Or
in
the
any
metal
metal
detector was
detectors or
broken.
scanners or anything like that. Yeah,
Who
so
knows?
I was pleasantly surprised with that too. So. But
Nice.
no, I'm looking forward to getting all that hardware taken out, and then I got
Yeah.
to find something to do with it. We should survey the listeners on what John should do with his metal and
Yeah.
screws.
You gotta keep that as a momentum for sure.
Make a bracelet or something. Make a bracelet or
Yeah.
something.
Something like that. Well, we were catching up last time, and there were some questions, follow-up questions that came up that we were going to hopefully talk about today, and along the lines of negotiating your compensation and some of the arrangements with these employment contracts. And John is the man when it comes to employment contracts and compensation. Your company has all kinds of experience and expertise in analyzing compensation agreements and helping, even like handholding through that whole process of like walking through the negotiation process. Because so we'll talk about it, and we can kind of teach you how to do these things yourself, or you could even Google and learn these kinds of things. But a lot of times it's nice to just save time, but also have that reassurance of having a person along the way to help you handhold you kind of through that experience. And that's what John's company
Yeah.
does really well. And it's a great service.
Yeah. No, there's so much good stuff out there online, and we put a lot of it out there for free.
Mm.
But we believe that every story matters, and the story of you can look at something online for a clause, but it doesn't lead into the physician's story or their family story. So, why is the position open? How many colleagues do you have? What happens if a colleague takes off? What's the history of the program? How does your story about I want to be there for 1 year and move, or 5 years and retire, or go part-time in 2 months, or
Mm.
have a child, like all those pieces of the story, right? They all play into how you should view some terms, whether it's negotiable or not. And that's one of the things that they get with a service like Contract Diagnostics, is they get that personal approach that says, this is how we can customize it to your story, not just some generic something that you read online, which we put out a lot of, but something how we can customize it back to the position. So we have a blast doing that here, as you know.
Yeah, and the families we work with that utilize that service across the board have better experiences. I guess the worst case scenario is that people are like in a pretty good spot. Like I get this confirmation that I'm in a really good spot, but more often than not, it's
Yeah.
more like improvement upon where they kind of envisioned things going, or awareness of some like landmines that were out there. So it's a big deal to like your job is a big deal. And these employment agreements are complicated, and there's a lot in there, and it's a lot of foreign language, and
Yeah.
it's a
Your
big commitment.
income. It's your biggest asset. Your biggest asset is your earning potential as a physician, and well aware on how a physician can protect themselves from, with insurances and disability and life and investments in the future, but making sure that you're earning the appropriate amount of money, or the most amount of money that you can is hyper important. And that's what we do every single day. People always look for how do I save a couple bucks here on my taxes, or how do I, save a percent of interest off my home purchase? But they're looking at like, I haven't had a raise in 5 years, or I don't even know if I'm paid fairly. And trying to save $1,000 on something, and you're being underpaid 40 grand a year or more. So it's a super important thing to dig into, which is why we have fun here. So we get to talk to great people, smart people about very, very important things.
Yeah, there's definitely lots to talk about. I think the good starting point is this whole, I think with physicians, there's a lot of turnover and a lot of burnout, or whatever you want to call it. Like a lot of physicians that are unhappy in their work. And so there's, lots of desire to leave. But then sometimes you realize there's surprises with contracts. Like, I don't know that everybody goes in eyes wide open on like what their contract limits them in terms of their ability to leave and what the obligations are. And if they can open up or go work for another practice nearby or those sorts of things. And they end up like getting the surprise on the back end when they're like 6 months in, they bought the really nice house in the city that they grew up in, and life is good, but work sucks. And they're like, I need to go work for the other place because this place is terrible. Like, I can't do this. And then they go to read through their contract again, and they're like, crap. Like, I got nothing. I got no option. I got to leave. I got to move away or else I'm stuck here. So non-competes, locking in people, bonuses that are tied to working a certain period of time. I think that's a super important area of contracts that sometimes are overlooked. And then there's some changes brewing too in the world of, well, not changes. There's some talk brewing around the non-compete world about potential changes we were kind of getting into before we started recording. So maybe we could start there. Like, what's going on with the non-competes?
Well, I mean, to kind of say, go back to what you said earlier, I mean, like, burnout's real, and there's lots of different recommendations coming out now by companies like MGMA with new survey data that just came out, which we have at Contract Diagnostics if anybody needs updated data set. But there's all kinds of new talk about burnout, about retention rates, about, how do you keep a physician around? Because everyone knows to turn a physician over, it can cost, $100,000, $200,000, $300,000 and everything when you look at lost productivity and locums and recruiting and adding someone on and, signing incentives and everything. So burnout and retention is super important it's becoming more and more important to employers. And I think rightfully so. I think a physician, there's obviously things that they can keep an eye out for so they don't do that, because again, your earning ability, your income, your physician's salary is one of your biggest assets over 10, 20, 30-year career. Now, how that plays into your contract and what happens if you're burned out, what happens if you want to leave, the termination provisions are vital. You have to buy tail insurance. That could be $100,000, any $5,000 to $150,000 payment on termination that you may or may not have. And it's not easy to finance tail insurance because unlike your new boat, the bank can't go take your boat back with your malpractice insurance tail purchase, right? So you can't just go back and you have to pay for it in essence. So it could be costly. And then how do you terminate? And then you have a non-compete, like you said. Those are super important things.
What are some example costs for tail? I can throw out some examples, but like you have a lot more experience. Like what's a typical range of costs for tail insurance? I know it's a big range.
Yeah, it all depends on the type of the physician, right? And to some degree where they're practicing and to some degree their history, right? So just like an automobile, if you have an older front wheel drive minivan, that's worth $1,000 or $5,000 and doesn't go very fast. And
what are you trying to say about front wheel drive minivans?
No, nothing. I'm saying that insurance is cheap, so they're really good purchases. But if you have a super fast red convertible sports car, right, probably going to be a little more. If you get a lot of speeding tickets, so you've got a track record of speeding tickets and driving recklessly and accidents, it's probably going to be a little more. Yeah. So just like with car insurance, it matters if you're a hospitalist seeing 15 patients a day, or if you're a high-risk OB physician delivering babies every single day, or if you're a neurosurgeon poking around in someone's brain or spine, right? So those different, so if you're seeing a diabetic, for their glucose levels and prescribing diabetes medications all day, it's much different risk level than if you're sticking needles and scalpels and cutting people open. So
I would say it's safe to say it's like the average is in the tens of thousands. Would you agree? Like on average?
Yes. But so the way that any physician can do a rough calculation is, and again, the cost per year. So you have to buy your malpractice insurance, just like if you have to buy your car insurance every year. But then tail insurance is if and when you leave, you may or may not have to buy it. So a good way to kind of calculate that, if you don't know, is to find out how much your malpractice premium costs every year. So that's a question that you can call the broker who sold you the policy, or your office manager, or you can call the HR department if you have one, and say, how much does my malpractice insurance cost you every year if the physician's not the one buying it, which is the common way is that the employer provides it. And then take that number and multiply it by 1.6 to 2.5. And it all depends on how long you're there. So if you're just there for a year, it's going to be on the lower end, 1.2, 1.4 times your premium. If you've been there for a 5-year period, a malpractice insurance typically matures over 5 years. So just to use examples, it might cost a family practitioner $6,000 year 1, $9,000 year 2, $15,000 year 3, $18,000 in year 4, and then $20,000 in year 5. And then it might just stay at $20,000, right? Or maybe I got it wrong. Maybe it's $6,000, $9,000, $11,000, $12,000, $15,000. And then it stays at $15,000. And so to tail out, you would generally take that 15,000 in the example and multiply it by 2 to 2.5.
Yeah.
So 15,000 means 30 grand, right? And that's a rough estimate on what you need to come to the table if you have to buy your tail insurance upon termination. And again, depending on the state, it might be different. Depending on where you're going, which your employer you're going to, that may be something you can negotiate. That might vary. So again, the story matters. So doing an internet search on tail insurance cost might give you some really, really good information. I encourage everyone to do that. But finding out your story and how does it matter, for example, if you're in Kansas, staying in Kansas, or Kansas moving to Missouri, but Kansas City sits on the state line. So if you're a mile in Missouri versus staying in Kansas, how does that impact your malpractice insurance? It does. People think state income tax, but there's also patient compensation funds in various states that matter as far as like how long you're there and how they cover tail and how they don't. And it's just a lot of nuance, no different than public student loan forgiveness, right? And I have to be at this facility and work this many hours. And if I do that for so long, then, but an asterisk and an asterisk. And so again, that's why it's good that there's folks out there that can help physicians through these times that maybe things aren't as cut and dry or black and white or binary, if you will, in a contract.
I think the key takeaway with the tail insurance is like being aware of how it affects you if you were to leave on the front end. Like ideally, when you're going in, you're aware of how who's going to cover tail, first of all, whether it's your employer or you. And second of all, if you're going to cover it, roughly what it's going to cost or some ballpark of what it's going to cost. Because if you end up in the burnout situation, like I gotta leave, like you need to know because what I have worked with people on multiple occasions, it is what it is. You got a lot of stuff going on. You kind of don't gloss over the tail, and then you end up having to leave, and it's a pretty big number. And it's like, we didn't have that in the picture. And if it's 50 grand, you're going to owe to tail. That's just another big factor in the mix. Non-competes.
Yeah. Well, it comes down to risk. And that's why, and I think it's a good segue into the non-compete, because when you're signing your contract, even if it's non-negotiable, right? They give you a contract and they say, here, don't even bother having anyone look at it because we're not going to change anything. It's non-negotiable. You still got to know your risk. You still got to have it looked at so you know what questions to ask. Because, again, so risk, whether they'll negotiate anything or not, risk. Can you get out? How do you terminate? When can you? What about malpractice tail insurance? What about a non-compete? What about how you're compensated on termination? What about, risk of things that aren't in the contract, like caps on call or PA coverage or, a certain resource or a technology that you might need, et cetera, et cetera. We could go on and on and on for hours. But portion of that risk which is, again, should be done on the front end. People call us and they'll say, John, I signed a thing 2 years ago. Can you help me get out? We're like, well, what do you have? They're like, I don't know. Nobody looked at it. I just signed it. I'm like, oh crap. And then those are the ones where you got to break news, say like, look, it's going to cost 60 grand to get out of this. They go, oh, $60,000. So I say all that because the risk assessment, right? And anything, as you're an investment guy, anything is risk and reward, right? I'm going to risk having less money today for the reward of having more money tomorrow. I'm going to risk losing my money in my 401k or in my directed plan from a professional like you guys. I'm going to risk that might go down for the benefit of it might go up. And hopefully I hire good people like Wrenne Financial and I could, have more benefit than risk. And it's the same thing with contracts. What's the risk, right? Well, termination, non-compete, tail insurance, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. What's the benefit? Well, it's about money. It's about benefits like vacation time. It's about, retirement accounts. It's about, income and bonuses. But if we go back to that risk piece, that non-compete is a big portion of the risk. And it's vital that a physician understands not just the non-compete, but the restrictive covenant. So the restrictive covenant would be, what you can't do either during or after the job, most likely both. So a restriction could be you can't work, you can't moonlight while you work here, or you can't own a pizza company while you work here unless you get our permission, depending on how the contract's worded. Another restriction would be you can't hire one of our employees or contractors after you work here. Another restriction would be you can't solicit the patients. They're ours, not yours. So if you leave, you can't take the patients with you. You don't own the patient. Those are all types of restrictive covenants that are not non-competes. Now, you may also have a non-compete, and non-competes would say for this, they're time bound, right? So for so many months or so many years, they're geographically bound. You can't do something in a certain area, whether it's a certain number of counties or a certain radius, and then obviously the more specific, the better. It's specific to your specialty or not. How detailed is it to your specialty? Is it, what's the time zones? And I think that's all super important for a physician to understand the non-competes, because we see them in most contracts, and even the states that don't have contracts, we don't see. I know there's been a lot of talk about, the FTC and President Biden, before Trump, and like what they wanted to do with non-competes, and maybe Biden can pound a gavel or wave a pen and everything goes away. And I didn't think that was going to happen when he announced it. I was, of course, cheering for it because I think it's good for our physicians, but I didn't think it was going to go through. We don't really have a whole lot of new data yet. I don't know that we're going to with the pending election and all the stuff that's going to come out. It might be a talking point for some of the candidates, but as far as President Biden waving a wand and magically, dissolving every non-compete for every worker in the country, I just don't think it's going to happen. And I think even if there is some federal regulation, I think there's going to be some different state changes and asterisks and everything else. I know one of the proposals was, okay, we'll do it with non-competes, but nonprofit institutions can have them. And you and I both know lots of hospitals tend to be nonprofit, or they might just be, exempt, right? So, a non-exempt employee would be under that rule. So maybe no non-competes for somebody who works at Starbucks or somebody who works at Home Depot versus Lowe's or something, right? Because they get paid hourly and they're an exempt person. For a physician, it wouldn't be. A physician, they don't get 15-minute breaks every 4 hours of work. They're not entitled to an hour-long lunch break. So they're exempt from some of those regulations, laws, rules. And so therefore, I'm assuming that there would be an asterisk for some of those employees, which would be physicians, or maybe it's people who earn over a certain dollar amount per year or have compensations. So the initial dollar amounts that I've seen, it would yield all physicians out of whatever carve out they would do, except maybe a part-time pediatrician. And then how does that impact nurse practitioners and PAs? Because they make less, but they're starting to make a whole lot more. It's so interesting and to kind of figure out try to project what's going to happen.
Yeah, who
but
knows?
At the end of the day, nobody knows. And I think even if something does go through, it's going to be superficial for somebody to get some good press on it. And then I think it's not really going to roll down to physicians. And if it does, I think that would be a good thing, because I think the physicians who are dedicated to a community because of a family or because the kids are in school or some reason, then they don't want to leave the community, but they want to leave the employer, and there's an option they just quote can't. I think that would be a great option for them, again, as you de-risk any agreement, right? So if that non-compete represents 10% of your risk or 20% of your risk in a deal, and you just take it out, that's great. Your benefit to risk ratio dramatically improves just by that. But will it automatically increase salaries? Are physicians' salaries suppressed because of non-competes? A lot of people say yes. I don't know. The new MGMA data is just out, and we've been analyzing it for weeks over here. And I do know that Massachusetts is one of the lowest paying states when it comes to specialty and primary care pay. And yet Massachusetts hasn't had non-competes in decades. And I look at the states that are paid the best, and there are states where non-competes are very active. So again, if a physician could just leave one job to go to the next because of a $2 per RVU difference, I think if they could do that, which they have been able to do that in certain markets, and I realize there's lots of other stuff going on from payer data and access and market demands and everything else, but we don't see salaries flushing up in states faster than others anyways, or even in the highest paid state, in states without non-compete. So how would it directly impact physician compensation? I don't think for the masses, I think the answer is it doesn't. For that highly, highly trained surgeon, I think the answer is it might. For that super productive pulmonologist, I think the answer is it might, because they could go back and say, look, if I can't get $3 more per RVU, the hospital next door will give it to me.
Right.
Now, again, can you solicit the patients? Maybe not. So again, just because there's not a non-compete doesn't mean there's not a non-solicitation. And your patients may or may not follow, and you may or may not continue to generate 12,000 RVUs a year. So there's so many we don't know, but
non-competes are pretty strict and solid, and non-solicit is kind of a little bit, I'm using simple terms, it's much more complicated, but non-solicit is a little bit more dialed down version. It's less restrictive, but you still can't go after your patients. Non-compete is nothing in this area. You can't do anything. So and they're pretty common, the non-compete. So that's important. I think the takeaway with non-competes is that everybody should know what their non-compete limits them to, and ahead of time before they even sign. Because if you're going to an area, especially if you're going to an area, well, I think anytime, but if you're going to an area I grew up here, or my family, or whatever, it's especially important. And I have worked with many people that basically kind of had to leave an area because a job didn't work out. And that's kind of not fair. It's your job dictating.
Or do locums for a year. Yeah.
Or had to go away and come back, which is just a mess. And it's not very, but how willing are employers to budge on these non-competes in your experience?
Yeah, it's a great question, man. And I think it depends on the situation, right? I think, again, why is the contract terminating in the first place? Is the service line just not busy? So you're not making as much money as you like. So you'd like to do something else. They might be fine letting you go and
Mm.
forgiving the non-compete because they're not doing what the program's not doing what they thought it would. Is the reason that you would like to stay in town because they don't have the technology? Well, that might be different. Do you want to open your own practice? If
Compete
so,
with them.
would you stay on at the hospital? And well, yeah, but I mean, again, there are some contracts have carve outs for private practices. So it'll say you can't work within 25 miles of my hospital. However, if you want to stay on staff at my hospital and open a private practice, you're more than welcome to.
Hmm.
Right. And again, it depends on the specialty. But if you're going to stay on staff at my hospital and admit your patients to my hospital, or if you're a surgeon, you'll do your cases at my hospital, and you're going to open a private practice and run your private practice like you want to, which means I don't have to pay for your malpractice insurance. I don't have to pay for your staff. I don't have to put you on my EMR system, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The hospital's like, I'll take that every day. So for the most part, again, every story matters, which is why it's important to call somebody like Contract Diagnostics. But that's where I think, when it comes to, even if you want to get out of a contract, like, you said, like, read your contract. No. Like, read your contract, but call us or call somebody like us and say, here's my story. Here's what the contract says. What do you recommend? Because we might be able to get very creative with ideas and strategies and tactics around helping a physician transition from one position to the next, or leave a position and ask for forgiveness around the restrictive covenant or the non-compete. So that creativity that we've learned over 12 years on what's possible, I think, is something that we love sharing with everybody. And that's why, whatever the situation is, the physician should definitely seek help and ideas, because maybe you read it, you think it's so solid, it's so concrete, you can't work for 25 miles. But maybe it says you can't do a certain portion of your job, or maybe it says you can't be a hospitalist, but you can go be an internist, or maybe and again, telehealth has kind of blown a lot of other things up too. So how does it deal with telehealth? I mean, so there's so many things that matter when it comes to restrictive covenants, that it's not just most of the time, it's not as simple as 25-mile non-compete from the office on Fifth Street. It's much, much more complicated than that. Even if it appears to be simple, they're generally, a half a page to 4 pages long in a contract, even though on the surface, you might think it says you can't practice for a year within 25 miles. But it takes them 4 pages to write that. Means there's a lot more to the story. And then a lot more creativity can come on the backside of it when we're helping a physician come up with creative solutions to a situation that they are not happy in, and they're looking for a transition.
Yeah. Another thing that I would be cautious about with contracts, related to contracts that can cause big old problems if you're leaving unexpectedly, is the front end bonuses, like the forgivable loans, they call them, but they frame it as a bonus, but it's really a forgivable loan based on staying a certain period of time. And those can be big surprises. They can also be big surprises tax-wise, even if you do stay. A lot of times that's not quite clarified, and all of a sudden you have a tax surprise. But understanding what those terms are, preferably, so like in a perfect simple world, which is never the case, but like ideally your employer covers your tail insurance. Ideally there's no non-compete. And ideally, like, the bonus is just your bonus and it's not tied to any level of service. That never happens, right? It's always going to have baggage attached. Like, they don't just typically, it's typically got some baggage attached if they're going to write you a big check. And sometimes they're long commitments. Like, I've seen like 5-year.
Yeah, it's all risk and reward, right?
Yeah.
The risk is you might have to give us money back if you quit in 1 year, 5 years, 3 years, whatever it is. The reward is we're going to give you money right now, $20,000, put down a house, or to buy a vacation, or to give to charity, or whatever you like to do with your extra
The
money.
problem with the job, especially a new job, is you're basing it off an unknown. Like, and the unknown is like, am I going to hate my job? Am I going to love my job? Am I going to be somewhere in the middle? And if you hate your job, in my opinion, it doesn't matter how much money you pay me. It's not worth it. Like, it's not worth it because you spend so much time in the job. The majority of your time living is your job. And if you're going to spend tons and tons of hours in a job that you hate, it doesn't matter how much money we're talking, it ain't worth it. So like, you have to be careful when you're going into an unknown, especially, brand new. I'm thinking people starting in practice for the first time or transitioning to a new location or whatever. Like, you're going to a brand new employer. You don't know what their culture is, even though everybody's going to tell you these things like, we're great and everybody's happy, but like, you don't really know until you get in there, and things can change always. And these really long especially the long ones, like I've seen like 5-year commitment period on, or like a big old bonus on the front end, 5-year commitment period. That can be like paralyzing, like just, and it amps up all this burnout stuff too. It's like if you're unhappy 6 months in, and then you realize you've used that bonus to buy a house, and real estate's been stagnant.
Interest is accruing. Right?
It's like, I got no choice but to like grind it out.
Yeah. Now, and again, there's ways that you can be creative with those types of things. If someone's offering you $100,000 for a 5-year commitment, you could say, guys, I'm willing to do a 2-year commitment. And for that, I'd like $40,000, but then I'd like retention payments of $20,000 after year 2 and after year 3 and after year 4, or at the beginning of year 3 and the beginning of year 4 and the beginning of year 5, knowing that they may want, you can tie each of those to a 1-year repayment. That way, maybe at the end of 2.5 years, you've received $60,000, but you only have to give back $10,000. Much more palatable, much depending on taxes in the state and your income and how you take it and everything else. Much different tax situation. Having $100,000 up front tax and then accruing interest for 5 years that you may or may have to give back at the full rate plus interest, even after you pay taxes on it. So lots of interesting ways that you can approach a situation like that, and that's just one of them. So, but again, like it's that may be proposed on the surface, but there might be some creative solutions to not saying I want 120,000 or I want the 100,000 forgiven over 3 years, but I want the 100,000 over 5, which is you said it's non-negotiable. I'm taking the 100 over 5. I'm just cutting up how I receive it, and that may be negotiable.
And that much more psychologically like tolerable, I guess. Like it's really difficult to get $100,000 and psychologically like not forget that you have to pay it back if you leave. It's just because you're going to tell yourself like, I'm good, it's going to work out, like everything's going to be fine. That's just what people do. They justify their thing, what's going on. And so,
and we can't predict the future.
No.
So that's what's tough.
Yeah. What do you think about in-training stipends?
Again, I hate to say it depends, but it depends. It's dependent on the situation, right? The physician who wants to go back to rural Kansas, where their family is, where they grew up, and they want to serve the community there for 20 years, and they're offering a stipend to sign now, and when you're going to sign anyways, I think that's a good idea. But again, I think it's the risk and the reward, right? So again, every story of the physician matters, and that risk and reward for each individual physician may be a little bit different, which means it may not make sense for everybody. But in general, I think that they're a good idea. I think they're smart by the hiring entity to get their physicians locked in. You and I have both seen and talked about the supply demand shortage in physicians, and how many more physicians we need. I just did a negotiation deal this morning for a urologist. The hospital's trying to hire 5 of them. And, I told the hospital, like, you're offering a signing bonus that's really not competitive, and you need 5. With all due respect, you're not gonna get any if you don't make this package more in line with what the competition is offering, right?
And how did they respond to that?
Oh, we'll see. We're not sure yet on the ask. But again, but all those things matter. And I think because of an employer knowing, look, we need more urologist or more fill in the blank, and we're going to need them over the next 5 years. There's nothing wrong with them signing a 2026 candidate, which we've seen. We've seen 2026 contracts come through already. So a physician who's starting practicing as an attending in 2026, they're already signed.
Yeah.
So, but again, I thought it made sense for that position. If 100 people gave us 2026 deals this week, I would think something sounds weird, because I don't know if that would make sense for 100 people all at the same time, because it's a unique story. But I do like the bonuses. And I do think, again, depending on the situation, maybe you've got 3 kids, maybe it's some extra money. Maybe you don't want to rack up credit card debt. Maybe you want to give more to charity, or you want to start your retirement savings early, or start paying down your student loan. There's so many things that additional money, typically $1,000 to $2,000, we've seen up to $3,000 or more per month, every single month of extra money. So what a resident and a fellow makes, and you add $2,000 or $3,000 on top of that every single month. It's a significant change to the way that they can live, especially if they have a family and financial needs.
Yep. Now it is, like you said, it's a risk in play there. So you got to consider the fact that it could blow up on you, like the employer could become a mess, or your family could move and you're moving there for that reason. And then all of a sudden you're like,
the hospital could sell, and the hospital could sell out, and the new owner's a jerk. And the medical director that you thought you were going to work for leaves, and you don't like the new person. And I mean, Yeah, so much can happen. I mean, you're a surgeon and you expect it to be 1 in 4 call, and it now becomes 1 in 2 call. There's so much stuff that can happen that's just out of your control.
Yeah, I would generally advocate for flexibility and not, locking in, because there's already, it seems like, especially for physicians in the career track, it's almost like everything leads them to be more locked in. It's like it starts the day that you start medical school. When you get your first student loan check, that's already like a first stage lock-in, because you now have a debt that you got to pay back. It's tied to, you got to make a living to pay that back, and medical school is necessary to get there. So, and then you get into training, and then you get into practice, and you start sign contracts and bonuses, and it's all trying, a lot of times it's kind of locking you down hard. And I think you got to advocate for some flexibility, because life doesn't work out, like you said. And with PSLF, that's another thing, man, that I have a lot of unhappy families that we've worked with that were kind of like doing the thing because of PSLF. And ideally though, you're in a position where you can do things based on what's best for, like you said, your story, and not based on the money. Like, the money comes secondary. Not to say like don't be doing dumb things with your money, but like your story first, like live your ideal life, then do all the money stuff, the contract stuff around that. That's the key. And that's, I think, really what I love what you're saying is about your story. It's like, you got to remember to put that front and center about like, what do you want your life to look like? What's most important to you? And then shape all the stuff around it. And that's what you guys do. And you can kind of like tailor it, right?
Yeah. And that's why, again, I think, I think there's so much really good information out there. There's so many great books that are written on physician contracts, and now we have ChatGPT and all that stuff, which we've got a really cool video on that. If you haven't seen my video on ChatGPT, it's on.
They can do contract reviews for you for free, right? Isn't that wasn't that your conclusion? Is ChatGPT replaces you?
They can, they can do it for free, and it'll be wrong. It was the conclusion, which is hilarious. Like, I mean, and again, I encourage anybody to look up the video that we did. I think it's on like social media and YouTube and that stuff.
Yeah, I'll link to it.
I mean, literally, you ask a ChatGPT, you take all the private information, of course, and you put the contract in there. And you say, hey, give me 5 red flags, and it's all wrong. And you say, well, do I have malpractice insurance? There's no mention of malpractice insurance, even though Section 5 says malpractice insurance, right? And then you say, well, how much am I going to get paid? And it says there's no mention of compensation, but Exhibit A says they get paid $40 in RVU. And then you ask ChatGPT, well, what should I make? They say, compensation, it's so difficult to negotiate. We don't even know. And they say, well, who do I negotiate with? And they say, we don't know. Maybe the CEO, it could be somebody else, but we don't know. And you're like, oh my gosh.
Come on, ChatGPT.
I encourage anyone to play around. Yeah. And I encourage anyone, and believe me, we're building our own tools here at Contract Diagnostics that are going to supercharge and help the physicians go through our system. But I'll tell you, there's lots of really good stuff online, but just like I can go to WebMD and I can look up a rash, right? But nothing's going to replace the judgment of a trained professional. And the 12 years of trial and error that we've had in figuring out what works with employers, how to negotiate, and what's the right question to ask. All that stuff is something that's not done when you can find that online, because again, every story matters. So that's what we love working with physicians. It's our passion. And it's why we have a free consult on our website. Anyone can go to contractdiagnostics.com and set up a 15-minute free consult and just talk to us for free and tell us your story. We love to hear them.
Yeah, I think that's great. And you have a couple of different service models to where you can do kind of a more full service handholding through the negotiation process, and then more of just like a less intensive review of compensation.
Yeah, a few $100. Just look, we're just going to send you some compensation data and talk to you about how you're getting paid, if it's appropriate or not, and give you some ideas of strategies for a few $100. Or, a more expensive package where we go through your contract and we call the employer and we create pages of notes, and we help you do the process so you can focus on what the physician's good at, which is providing care to their patients, and then they can be with their family in their spare time. So yeah, and everything in between, of course. But
if anybody's listening and you've had, if you're in practice and it's been a really long time since you've looked at anything, and especially if you have some suspicion of like maybe you're being underpaid, or like maybe there's some,
I would say 3 years.
3 years is
every 3
or
years.
longer.
I would say every 2 or 3 years.
So if you've been sitting on your contract for 5 years and just chilling, and you've heard some gossip about other people getting paid more, like whatever it is, if you've just not even looked at anything in 5 years, like that's where at minimum something like that compensation RX would be like a good starting point to at least kind of like test the waters on where you're at.
It's no different than you check your cholesterol because you don't, like you had it checked a while back and it was low or it was high, but you still do it every year, every other year, because you want to get ahead of it. If it needs attention, you want to be ahead of a heart attack.
And the worst thing it says is like, you're doing pretty good. You're solid. I guarantee
the worst thing is,
odds are super high that y'all are going to have like stuff there's always things to improve, but.
Well, I would say, think of the employers. We generally think employers mean well for physicians and, they don't want to burn them out. And even though some of the physicians that we work with disagree with us on that, but we generally think the employers want the physicians to succeed and be happy and work there for a long time and do everything they can to accomplish that. However, their job is to maximize revenue and minimize expenses. Physician salaries are expenses.
Right.
So, they want their bonus, and their bonus is based on top line growth, right? Profits. And obviously the way to get that is to work your physicians more and pay them less. So the interest of the administration is to obviously, I would assume, keep great talent and keep them happy and everything else, but squeeze it as much as they can so they can maximize their bonus. And again, which is fine, right? America, healthcare, capitalism, it is what it is, like it or not. However, I would say that just like you check your cholesterol or you get your oil change in your car to avoid a catastrophic, you should call Contract Diagnostics and look at your compensation data, but not just go to Doximetry and say, what does a family practice doctor make in Chicago? Okay, that doesn't take into account your story. So again, because your story matters, that's where we give you the data and we do a 30-minute call with you so we can hear your story and then we can customize an approach. Because I can give you a number all day, right? You should have a total cholesterol under 200 and LDLs of 7. Okay, but it doesn't take into account, do I have family history? What about if my HDL is 120? Does that matter? What if I'm on a ketogenic diet or a vegan diet? What if I'm a smoker or I don't smoke? What if I exercise or I don't exercise, right? What if I'm a male or a female? So all those things, you start putting that in there, and then all of a sudden 70 starts looking, or 170 starts looking better or worse, right? So the story of the patient matters, no different than the story of the physician matters when it comes to compensation, understanding it, negotiating it, and everything in between, which is why we're here, of course.
Yep. I'm a big fan of what you guys are doing. So keep up the good work, and always good to have a conversation about contracts. I mean, at the end of the day, contract itself is kind of boring and legalese, but like, it's really important to have. We make the best of it, but at the end of the day, it's like, what pays the bills? It's like, that's the gasoline to the engine. I mean, that drives the ship. And so it's important to pay attention to what your compensation looks like and how all that's structured. So John, I appreciate you coming on as always.
I love a deal. Absolutely, man. Anything we can do to help your guys, your gals, just reach out. If they have a question for me, ping you. I'm sure they know your email address. And
keep the questions coming.
Answer any question at any time.
Yeah, keep the questions coming. If y'all have particular areas you want to dig into, we'll keep the conversation going and it'll be fun.